Lady Clare had grown up in a world gilded by duty and polished by expectations. From the moment she first walked through the corridors of her family's London townhouse, she had been trained to understand that her life was not her own. The Earl of Wexford, her father, and the Countess, her mother, saw her not simply as a daughter, but as the embodiment of their lineage, the vessel through which alliances would be secured and prosperity preserved. She had been educated with care, reading the poets of France, reciting the verses of Milton, playing the harpsichord with delicate precision, all so that one day she might reflect the honor of her house before the eyes of the court. London in 1768 was a stage of opulence where every noble family sought to display its power. The season was the pinnacle of social life, a parade of silks and jewels, where the value of a young lady was measured by the suitors she attracted and the wealth her marriage could secure. Clare moved within this world with poise, but beneath her composure was a soul both eager and anxious. Admiration followed her wherever she appeared. Gentlemen bowed with admiration for her beauty. Ladies whispered of her grace. Yet Clare herself felt only the weight of expectation, as if every bow and whisper pressed chains of obligation more tightly upon her shoulders. Her days were filled with lessons and preparations, evenings with visits to assemblies and salons. At every gathering her mother observed her keenly, calculating which suitors might serve their ambitions. To be admired was not enough. Clare must bring advantage to her family name. For her, the notion of love seemed more like a fanciful story found in novels, for in the circles she moved, marriage was a contract, carefully measured and bargained. Still, she sometimes dreamed of a gentler destiny, though she never dared to give those dreams voice. It was late in the season, when the gilded halls of London seemed more crowded than ever, that whispers began to circulate. They were not whispers of Clare's suitors, nor of her gowns, but of a figure far above her reach, Prince Philip, cousin to the king. The court had long speculated whom he might marry, for his alliance was of weighty consequence. Yet there was little eagerness among the noble families to offer their daughters, for Philip was not a man of gentle reputation. He was admired for his lineage and his presence, but feared for his temper. Stories circulated of his ruthless dealings, of how he could reduce a man with a single cutting word, or command silence in a room with nothing more than a glance. When the Earl of Wexford summoned Clare to his study on a quiet afternoon, she entered with no suspicion of what awaited her. The heavy curtains filtered the light, casting shadows across the shelves of books and polished mahogany. Her father's expression bore the solemnity of triumph. Her mother stood beside him, her eyes bright with the satisfaction of a plan fulfilled. They told her with steady voices that her future had been secured. She was to be promised to Prince Philip. The words rang in her ears, at first without meaning, then with crushing clarity. She would be his betrothed. The match her parents had orchestrated was beyond any she might have imagined. It was an honor beyond measure, they said. It would elevate their family to a position no other union could secure. To them, it was perfection. To Clare, it was a sentence. Her lips parted as though to protest, but no sound escaped. She had been raised to obey, to reflect composure and gratitude, not to question. Yet her heart beat with a fierce rhythm, each pulse echoing the thought that she would be bound to a man the world feared. She had heard the stories whispered by the ladies in drawing rooms, the warnings murmured among servants. To be admired from afar was one thing, to belong to him was another. The days that followed were a blur of preparations. A gown of ivory silk was chosen for the ball at which the announcement would be made. Jewels were selected from the family collection, tokens meant to display wealth and status. Clare stood still as the seamstress measured, her arms lifted in silence, her mind spinning with dread. Every stitch of silk seemed like another knot tightening around her. When the evening arrived, the Wexford townhouse was alive with activity. Lamps were lit, carriages prepared, and the air filled with the scent of perfume. Clare descended the grand staircase, her gown trailing behind her, her hands trembling within their gloves. The Earl and Countess beamed with pride, their daughter appearing every inch the vision of nobility. Yet behind her calm face, her thoughts churned with fear. St. James's Palace glittered with light that night. Chandeliers scattered golden radiance across mirrors and polished floors as nobles gathered in their finery. The orchestra played, the dancers moved in graceful patterns, and conversation rippled through the air like a tide of silk. It was into this sea of splendor that Claire was led, her parents guiding her toward her fate. Prince Philip was already there. He stood among the courtiers, tall and imposing, his figure marked by authority. His expression was carved from stone, his movements precise, his every glance commanding. Nobles approached him with bows and curtsies. Each one met with the cool acknowledgement of a man accustomed to reverence. When his gaze fell upon Claire, it lingered with a weight that made her chest tighten. It was not admiration, nor warmth, but possession. The moment of announcement came with the ringing voice of the herald. In tones both formal and grand, he declared the betrothal of Lady Claire of Wexford to Prince Philip, cousin to the king. Applause rose from the crowd, murmurs of approval weaving through the air. Ladies whispered behind their fans, men exchanged looks of calculation. To the court, it was a triumph, a match of brilliance. Claire stood as if sculpted from marble, her heart racing beneath her bodice. She curtsied when expected, accepted congratulations with a polite smile, and inclined her head at the words of admiration. Yet every gesture felt hollow, every smile forced. She was no longer herself. She was the promise of another's ambition, the possession of a man she did not know and could not trust. As the evening wore on, she remained at Philip's side, their proximity demanded by custom. He spoke little, his silence heavier than words. When he did turn toward her, his eyes were unwavering, and she felt as though he could see the very tremor of her soul. Around them, the court celebrated, the music swelled, and laughter rang. Yet for Claire, the ballroom had become a prison of light and mirrors, every glance upon her binding her more tightly to a fate she could not escape. And as the night drew toward its end, as the music softened and the crowd began to thin, Claire felt her heart sink further. For though she had endured the public announcement, she sensed that what awaited her beyond the glittering hall would weigh heavier still. She did not yet know that before the dawn arrived, she would be summoned to hear the prince's first words to her alone. The ballroom had begun to empty, yet its golden light still dazzled the senses. The chandeliers burned steadily, their wax dripping in silence, and the scent of flowers from the great arrangements lingered in the heavy air. Claire remained near her parents, her hands clasped tightly together, her smile fixed, though her lips trembled. The announcement of her betrothal had been met with applause, with murmurs of admiration, but beneath that sea of voices, she felt a profound isolation. As carriages were summoned for the departing guests, the Earl and Countess of Wexford spoke with friends and allies, their faces radiant with triumph. They were surrounded by nobles who congratulated them on their daughter's fortune, each remark another reminder that Claire's life was no longer her own. Every word seemed to echo against her chest like a hollow drum. She nodded when expected, bowed her head when proper. But her thoughts lay elsewhere, circling in dread around the man who now stood a short distance away, speaking with courtiers in clipped, assured tones. Prince Philip's presence seemed to dominate the hall even as its crowd diminished. His figure was tall and unyielding, his expression unreadable. No one dared address him without hesitation, and those who did so kept their words brief, their gazes cautious. Claire observed him as one might watch a storm cloud gathering above. He was admired, certainly, but it was an admiration tinged with unease, as though each courtier remembered some rumor, some tale whispered of his merciless authority. She could not recall a single story that spoke of kindness. When the final strains of music faded and the hall grew quieter, Claire prepared to leave with her parents. Yet before she could step toward the doors, a royal chamberlain approached, his bow deep, his tone formal. He informed her that the prince wished for a word in private before the night concluded. Her heart tightened painfully at the command. There was no question of refusal. The Countess adjusted her daughter's gown with an approving hand and encouraged her forward, proud that the prince should seek her company so soon. The chamberlain led her through a side corridor, the soft glow of lamps guiding their way. The echoes of footsteps sounded against the marble floor, each one carrying Claire nearer to the man whose name alone filled the court with caution. At the end of the passage, a tall door stood half open, its shadow stretching across the stone. With a gesture, the chamberlain announced her presence and withdrew, leaving her to enter. Within, the chamber was quiet and austere. Heavy curtains covered the windows, and a single candelabrum burned upon the table, its light sharp against the polished surface. Prince Philip stood near the hearth, his figure rigid, his hands clasped behind his back. The fire cast an orange glow across his features, sharpening the severity of his profile. He did not move as she entered, nor did he offer a word of greeting. He simply turned his gaze upon her, and in that gaze Claire felt the weight of command pressing down upon her. For a moment, the silence was unbearable. Her breath caught in her throat as she waited, uncertain of what he intended to say. Then his voice filled the chamber, low yet unyielding, every word precise. He told her that their union would demand much from her. He spoke not of affection, nor of companionship, but of obedience. He reminded her that the eyes of the court would be upon them, that her role as his wife would be to stand without falter at his side, reflecting honor, discipline, and restraint. His words struck her like cold steel. They left no space for tenderness, no room for the gentle dreams she had carried in secret. She was to be an ornament of duty, not a companion of the heart. As he spoke, Claire felt her spirit recoiling, yet she forced her face into stillness, as she had been trained. The lessons of her upbringing demanded silence, demanded composure, though her heart throbbed with humiliation. She lowered her gaze to the floor, unable to meet his eyes for long. Every instinct urged her to retreat, to flee the suffocating atmosphere of command that filled the chamber. Yet her feet remained rooted, bound by propriety, by the knowledge that disobedience on this night could undo her family's triumph. Still, her mind turned with frantic speed, imagining the life that stretched before her, a life lived not in companionship, but in submission. The prince's voice softened slightly, though its firmness remained. He declared that appearances would be everything, that together they must project strength, even if strength meant silence. He would demand loyalty, and in return he would secure her a position no woman could hope to surpass. The words carried promise of power, yet to Claire they felt like chains, heavy and unyielding. When at last he dismissed her, she curtsied with mechanical grace, her knees trembling beneath the weight of her gown. The corridor seemed colder as she stepped back into its silence. The chamberlain, waiting patiently, guided her once more toward the great hall where her parents awaited. Yet the light of the chandeliers no longer dazzled her. The splendor of the palace seemed hollow, each gilded surface reflecting not triumph, but captivity. Her mother smiled upon seeing her return, eager to hear of the encounter, though Claire said nothing. She could not summon words that would not betray her trembling heart. The Countess assumed her daughter's silence was simply modesty, and the family departed the palace in satisfaction, their carriage wheels echoing against the cobblestones of London. Inside, Claire sat rigid, the motion of the carriage swaying her body but not loosening the tightness in her chest. Her father spoke proudly of alliances secured, of the honor bestowed upon their house. Her mother praised the prince's discernment in choosing her. Claire heard every word as though through a veil, the sound muffled, her thoughts consumed by the memory of Philip's command. When at last they arrived home, she retreated to her chamber without excuse. Alone, she stood before the tall mirror, her reflection pale in the candlelight. The jewels upon her neck sparkled, but they seemed foreign, as though belonging to another. She raised a trembling hand to her face, her eyes filling with the tears she had held back. In her silence, the humiliation of the night pressed down upon her, and yet beneath that weight she remembered the prince's gaze. For though his words had been sharp and cold, There had been, for a fleeting instant, something that unsettled her more deeply than his severity. It was the memory of that fleeting glance, an impression of something hidden, something unspoken, that haunted her most as the candles burned low. The following days moved forward with a suffocating weight, as if time itself pressed more heavily upon Claire. The grand announcement at the palace had left its mark. The city seemed to buzz with her name, though never in ways she could control. From the moment she awoke, the rhythm of expectation dictated her hours. Her mother entered her chamber each morning with a list of letters and calls to answer, while servants hovered with gowns and ribbons, preparing her for the endless parade of formalities that had begun the very night she was promised. Congratulations arrived without pause. Letters, sealed in wax and adorned with careful signatures, came from relatives near and far, from acquaintances she scarcely remembered, and from those who sought to share in her newfound status.
Each word was filled with admiration, with assurances of fortune and honor. Claire accepted them with the same outward grace she had always displayed, but when alone, she felt each page as a weight upon her heart. For every congratulation seemed to declare her imprisoned future, every elegant phrase reminding her that she had been sealed to a man whose very name stirred unease. Her chamber, once a place of quiet refuge, became a prison of silk and candlelight.
She found herself pacing the length of the carpet, her hands clasped before her, her breath uneven. She imagined the years ahead, the endless ceremonies, the coldness of a husband who spoke of nothing but obedience. Her life, once filled with secret hopes for tenderness, seemed suddenly without color. Even the thought of love, once a gentle flame she carried in secret, now appeared like a child's dream extinguished beneath the stern hand of reality. Her parents, however, saw none of this despair. They spoke of her triumph with pride, never pausing to consider what their daughter felt. The Earl of Wexford, in his grave and confident manner, reminded her that this was the honor of a lifetime, the highest station she could possibly reach. The Countess, delighted with her own success, ensured that no detail of her daughter's appearance was left unattended. They did not ask if Claire was content, for they had no need to know. Their ambition was satisfied, and they expected hers to be as well. The court itself swirled with whispers, though never openly. At gatherings, Claire heard her name spoken just beyond the reach of her ear, saw the sideways glances that followed her entrance. Some envied her, admiring her beauty and fortune. Others pitied her, their eyes lingering a moment too long, filled with unspoken sympathy. And though no one dared to question the prince's choice aloud, every bow and curtsy carried the knowledge of his fearsome reputation. To the world, she was fortunate beyond measure. To herself, she was a figure wrapped in silken chains. One evening, when the house had quieted and the servants' footsteps had faded into silence, Claire stood before her mirror in solitude. The reflection that gazed back at her seemed no longer her own. The jewels her mother had insisted she wear sparkled at her neck, but she saw only a stranger adorned for a part she had not chosen. Her pale face revealed the truth of her sleepless nights, her eyes heavy with shadows that no powder could disguise. For the first time, she allowed her tears to fall freely, unguarded, her hands trembling against the polished surface of the dressing table. She thought of escape, of refusing the path set before her, but the thought withered as quickly as it came. She could not shame her family. She could not undo the triumph her father spoke of with such pride. The chains of duty were invisible, yet unbreakable. She pressed her palms against the glass of the mirror, her breath fogging its surface, and felt as though she were staring at a bird trapped within a gilded cage. Her heart ached for something she could not name. Freedom, tenderness, perhaps even the smallest fragment of compassion. But in her mind echoed the words of the prince, spoken in that cold chamber after the announcement. He had spoken of obedience, of appearances, of loyalty demanded. There had been no mention of affection, no promise of kindness. If such things existed within him, they were buried deep, hidden from her and from the world. The sound of footsteps in the corridor startled her from her thoughts. She hastily wiped her tears, though the redness of her eyes betrayed her grief. A soft knock came upon her door, and with it, a voice announcing a visitor. It was not her mother, nor one of her companions from the court. It was the voice of the woman who had once guided her hand in childhood, who had taught her letters and gently corrected her speech. It was her old governess, returned after many years, requesting to see her without delay. Claire hesitated, her heart still heavy with despair, before calling softly for the visitor to enter. The door creaked open, and in that instant, the room's silence seemed to shift, as though the weight of her solitude had been interrupted by something unexpected. The door opened with a slow creak, and the familiar figure of Claire's governess stepped quietly into the chamber. Though age had touched her hair with strands of silver, her posture remained steady, her presence as composed as it had been in Claire's childhood. She had not been in daily attendance for some years, yet her return on this night felt almost providential. Claire, still seated near the mirror with her gown heavy about her, lifted her tear-stained face in surprise, unsure of whether to hide her distress or to let it show. The governess, who had once guided her through her earliest lessons, had always carried with her a calm dignity, the kind that seemed to draw silence into order. She crossed the room with unhurried steps, her eyes resting on Claire with a look not of judgment, but of understanding. She did not ask the reason for her tears. The truth of them was already written in the air between them. Instead, she lowered herself into the chair opposite and folded her hands, her voice steady as she reminded Claire of the strength she had always seen in her. Her words did not attempt to erase the pain. She spoke of storms and tempests, of how the fiercest winds could strip branches bare, and yet beyond them lay skies that always cleared. She spoke of dignity, of the quiet power that comes when one chooses not to bend under the gaze of others. To Claire, these words were both comfort and challenge. They suggested that even within a life constrained by duty, there might be a way to hold her spirit intact. The governess did not promise that the path ahead would be gentle, only that Claire possessed within her the fortitude to walk it. Claire listened, her tears subsiding though her heart remained heavy. She remembered the years when this woman had been her constant guide, when each lesson carried not only knowledge, but also a quiet strength. Those memories pressed upon her now, reminding her that she was not as powerless as she felt. She was to marry a man whose reputation darkened every corridor of the court, yet perhaps within her still lay the resolve to meet him not as a trembling captive, but as a woman capable of standing tall. As the governess rose to depart, she touched Claire's hand briefly, a simple gesture that lingered long after the door had closed behind her. Alone once more, Claire stood and moved toward the tall window. The night pressed in over London, its silence deep and unbroken, save for the faint clatter of a distant carriage. She gazed out over the darkened city, the flicker of lamps dotting the streets below like scattered embers. For the first time since the announcement, she felt a spark of something unfamiliar, an awakening not of joy, but of resolve. She understood that she could not alter the choice that had been made for her. The alliance was fixed, the expectation unshakable. But she could choose how she carried herself, whether she would face the prince with bowed head or with steady eyes. That small decision was hers alone, and it would determine whether her life became a quiet surrender or something more resilient. The candle upon her table burned lower, its flames swaying in the faint draft from the window. She remained there, her gown pooling about her feet, her hands resting lightly on the sill. The governess's words echoed in her mind, threading through her sorrow like a fragile line of strength. Yet even as she clung to that thought, another pressed against her heart with equal force. The memory of the prince's eyes in the chamber at St. James's. There had been a glimmer there, brief and unguarded, that unsettled her more than his severity. It was that glimmer, unspoken and unexplainable, that filled her with unease. The clock in the hall struck the late hour, its chimes carrying through the quiet house. Claire extinguished the candle and turned from the window, her gown whispering across the floor. She could not know what the morning would bring, but she sensed already that her resolve would soon be tested. For with the dawn would come a summons, and it would be Prince Philip himself who demanded her presence. The summons arrived with the first pale light of morning. A servant knocked upon Claire's chamber door, his tone measured and formal as he delivered the message. Prince Philip wished to see her at once. There was no explanation, no hint of what the meeting would contain, only the command itself, which carried the weight of inevitability. Claire rose slowly from her seat by the window where she had spent much of the night in restless thought, and allowed her maid to adjust her gown and hair. Though her hands trembled, she kept her face still, remembering the governess's words about strength that did not bend. The corridors of the townhouse were cool and quiet as she descended to meet the carriage that would take her to him. The ride through London was brief, the city only just stirring awake. Market stalls were being set, their keepers calling softly to one another, while a grey mist clung to the cobblestones. Claire looked out through the small window, her reflection faintly visible in the glass, her heart beating so fiercely she thought it might betray her composure before she even arrived. When the carriage stopped at the palace, she was led inside at once. The servants moved silently, their expressions unreadable, and Claire felt as though each step carried her deeper into a world where no warmth lingered. At the end of a long hallway, hung with heavy tapestries, a door stood open. She was ushered through it and left alone, the door closing behind her with a sound that echoed like finality. The chamber was dim, the curtains drawn tight, the fire in the hearth burning low. Prince Philip stood near it, his figure tall, his posture unyielding. Yet when he turned toward her, the severity of his expression was marked not by authority, but by something quieter, something that unsettled her far more than his cold commands. His face was pale in the flickering light, his eyes shadowed as though he had not slept. For a long moment, neither spoke. The silence stretched, filled only by the crackle of the fire. Claire's breath quickened, but she forced her gaze to meet his. Then, with a voice lower than she had ever heard from him, he began to speak. Gone was the tone of command that had chilled her in their last meeting. Instead, his words carried the weight of confession. He spoke of nights without rest, of memories that plagued him, of a solitude so heavy that it had turned his temper sharp and his presence feared. He did not excuse himself, nor seek to soften his reputation. He laid it bare, as though in speaking to her he risked stripping away the armor he wore before the rest of the world. And then, when his voice fell to near a whisper, he admitted the words that struck Claire more deeply than any she had ever heard. She was his only salvation. The chamber seemed to grow still around them. Claire's heart pounded, not with fear alone, but with a disquiet she could not name. She had expected commands, perhaps warnings, but not this. His confession unsettled her more than his severity had, for it revealed a man not only cruel but also wounded, desperate, and unbearably human. She stood motionless, her hands clasped before her, unable to speak. The weight of his words pressed upon her, filling her with a mixture of confusion, compassion, and dread. Was this sincerity, or another layer of the same authority that bound her? Was she to be the cure for a torment she did not yet understand? The question swirled within her, unanswered, as she lowered her gaze to the floor. When at last the silence became too heavy, she curtsied and turned to leave. Her steps carried her across the chamber, her gown whispering over the stone. She did not look back, but she felt his eyes upon her until the door closed. The corridor outside was colder than she remembered, its shadows longer, its air sharper. Each step she took echoed, carrying her further from the firelight of the chamber, yet closer to the turmoil within her own heart. By the time she reached her carriage again, the morning mist had lifted slightly, though the air remained heavy. She sat within the enclosed space, her hands resting upon her lap, her thoughts tumbling over one another. Nothing in her upbringing had prepared her for such words, for the weight of being called salvation by a man whose presence terrified all. She could not decide if it was truth or manipulation, if it was weakness or another form of power. The carriage wheels rattled over the stones as London passed outside. Claire leaned her head back against the seat, her eyes closing briefly. She wished for the calm she had felt the night before when her governess's voice had filled her with strength. Yet now, strength alone seemed inadequate. She needed clarity, but clarity remained distant, hidden within the shadows of the prince's eyes. When at last the carriage drew to a halt before her own home, she stepped out into the daylight, her composure intact, though her heart still raced. The servants bowed, unaware of the storm within her, and she ascended the steps to her chamber once more. The silence of the house wrapped around her, but it was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of secrets, of truths too heavy to share. She crossed to her window, throwing it open to the cool air. The city spread before her, alive with sound now, its streets crowded, its markets bustling. Yet none of it reached her fully. She could hear only his words, repeating in her mind with unrelenting persistence. "You are my only salvation." Her gaze drifted upward to the pale sky, and for the first time, she felt a flicker of something she had not expected. Not hope, not affection, but a dangerous curiosity. For if the cruel prince carried within him a wound unseen, then what else might lie hidden behind his mask of severity? The thought unsettled her deeply, and as the wind stirred the curtains, she realized the truth that weighed most heavily. The court would soon gather again, and in its watchful eyes, she would be forced to stand at his side. The evening of the banquet arrived, with all the weight of expectation pressing upon Claire's shoulders. Servants moved swiftly through the Wexford townhouse, carrying boxes of silks and jewels, preparing their mistress for her appearance at court. Claire stood in the center of her chamber, while her mother's chosen gown was drawn over her shoulders, a shimmering fabric of pale blue that caught the light like water. The bodice was fitted, the sleeves adorned with lace, the skirt heavy with layers that swayed with every movement. Her maid adjusted the delicate necklace at her throat, and though the jewels glimmered, Claire felt none of their brilliance reach her heart. The carriage ride to St. James's Palace was hushed, her parents speaking in tones of satisfaction, proud that their daughter would once more be seen in the company of the prince. Claire sat opposite them, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her gaze fixed on the shadows that slipped past the window. The rhythm of the wheels over the cobblestones echoed her racing thoughts. She remembered the prince's confession, the words that had unsettled her more than any command, and she wondered how she would bear herself beside him when every eye in the hall turned upon them. The palace was alive with light and music when they arrived. The banquet hall stretched vast and splendid, its high ceilings adorned with gilded moldings, its long tables heavy with polished silver and platters of food. Candles blazed in every corner, their glow reflected in the mirrored walls. Nobles filled the room, their laughter carrying above the strains of the musicians, their movements precise and rehearsed as they drifted from one group to another. Yet beneath the brightness of the scene lingered an air of tension, as though the grandeur itself was but a veil stretched thin over something sharp. Claire was led to her place near the head of the table where Prince Philip already sat. His figure was unmistakable, tall and upright, his posture commanding even in stillness. He greeted her with a brief nod, his face unreadable, and then turned his gaze back to the hall. Claire lowered herself into her seat beside him, her pulse quickening, aware that all around her the court observed with interest, too carefully concealed to be polite. The meal began, and conversation flowed, but it was measured, cautious. The presence of the prince seemed to hold the entire company in quiet restraint. Yet the balance of the evening shifted when a noble seated further down the table, emboldened by wine, allowed his tongue to slip. He spoke with mockery veiled as wit, casting an insult in the prince's direction with words dressed in civility, but barbed beneath their polish. The laughter of those near him faltered, the air tightening in an instant. Philip rose, his chair pushed back with a sound that cut through the hall more sharply than any instrument. His voice followed, low and commanding, but edged with a fury that left no room for doubt. His words struck at the offender with precision, stripping away his arrogance in front of all. The noble's face paled, his laughter silenced, and those around him lowered their gazes, unwilling to share in his humiliation. The reputation of the prince for severity was confirmed once more, displayed for every guest to witness. Claire sat frozen, her hands clenched beneath the tablecloth. The hall itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the storm to pass. The prince's anger was sharp, unyielding, threatening to shatter what little ease remained among the guests. And yet, without thought, she leaned forward, her hand brushing the polished surface of the table in a quiet gesture of stillness. She did not speak, she did not command, but the subtle movement drew his attention. Philip's eyes flicked toward her, the storm within them faltering. For a moment, the rage seemed to drain from his posture, his shoulders loosening, his voice falling silent. The hall, sensing the shift, dared to exhale. The musicians, who had nearly stilled their bows, continued their song once more. Conversation resumed, cautious but steady. The outburst had been contained, though the mark of it lingered on the air. The courtiers noticed, though none dared speak of it openly. Their glances darted between Claire and the prince, their curiosity sharp. It had been her presence, her quiet defiance of silence, that had calmed him when no one else in the court would have dared intervene. To them, it was remarkable and dangerous. To Claire, it was bewildering. She had not planned it, yet something within her had moved instinctively, and the effect was undeniable. The banquet continued, the courses served one after another, the air thick with perfume and candle smoke. Claire ate little, her appetite absent, her thoughts consumed by what had just occurred. She had glimpsed once more the temper for which the prince was feared, and yet she had also witnessed it yield, if only slightly, to her presence. The knowledge unsettled her, filling her with equal measures of fear and unease. When the meal concluded, and the guests began to disperse into the adjoining chamber for music and cards, whispers moved swiftly through the hall. Ladies covered their mouths with fans, men leaned close to one another, and though their words were quiet, the subject was clear. Claire felt their eyes upon her as she walked beside the prince, their curiosity following her with every step. The night wore on, yet the unease did not fade. When at last Claire returned to her parents' carriage, the weight of the evening pressed upon her. The streets of London lay dark outside the window, but within her thoughts remained bright with tension. She had seen how quickly the prince could ignite into fury, and she had felt how strangely her presence could temper it. The court had seen it too, and that knowledge filled her with dread. As the carriage rattled on toward home, she understood with chilling clarity that her position beside him had already begun to draw attention. What had seemed a private struggle now unfolded beneath the watchful eyes of all. And when she returned to her chamber and closed the door behind her, she could not shake the feeling that whispers would already be moving through the corridors of the palace, carrying her name into dangerous speculation. The morning after the banquet dawned gray, the sky above London heavy with clouds that pressed low over the rooftops. Claire rose from her bed unrested, her sleep having been broken by troubled thoughts that circled without end. The memory of the previous evening returned in fragments, the gleam of candlelight on polished silver, the sharpness of Philip's anger, and the strange silence that had followed when she had dared to still him with nothing more than her quiet presence. She moved about her chamber in silence, her maid fastening the laces of her gown, but her thoughts were not on the day's attire. She wondered instead about the whispers that had already begun to weave their way through the court. The look in the eyes of the ladies, the guarded murmurs of the gentlemen, all made it certain. They had seen the prince yield to her, if only for a moment, and in that instant they had marked her not as a passive bride-to-be, but as someone who carried an influence no one else possessed. When she descended to the breakfast room, her parents were already seated. The countess looked pleased, her smile betraying her satisfaction at the talk that must have reached her. The earl read from a letter just delivered, his expression grave yet proud. He spoke of the attention their family now received, though his words were careful, reminding Claire that her every gesture would now be judged with greater severity than ever before. To her parents, this was the very power they had sought through the match. To Claire, it felt like a trap tightening around her. By midday, the whispers had grown sharper. A note, slipped into her hand by a servant who would not meet her eye, carried words that chilled her. Written in a hurried hand without a seal, it warned that she had already made enemies, that her place beside the prince had stirred envy and resentment among the courtiers. There were those who believed she bewitched him, others who feared the change her presence might bring. She tore the letter into pieces, unwilling to show it to anyone, but the warning would not leave her mind. Each time she entered a room, she felt the eyes upon her. Some gazes were filled with curiosity, others with suspicion, and a few with outright hostility, thinly veiled beneath courtesy. At a gathering that afternoon, she walked among the ladies, their fans fluttering as they leaned close to one another. Their smiles were gracious, their words polite, but their eyes betrayed them. They studied her as though she were a puzzle they had yet to solve, their curiosity edged with malice. Philip's presence only intensified the scrutiny. He stood among the men, his voice measured, his demeanor as commanding as always. Yet Claire could sense his watchfulness, the way his gaze occasionally flickered toward her, as though measuring the effect she had upon those around them. That watchfulness, instead of reassuring her, only deepened her unease. For while he defended her place with his silence, it also bound her more tightly to him, making her a target for every discontented whisper. By evening, her father returned to her with words that made her heart falter. He spoke quietly, yet his tone carried weight. Certain lords, he said, had begun to speak of her influence in a way that threatened to stain her reputation. They questioned her intentions, accused her of seeking power through the prince's temper, and hinted at scandal. Though none dared confront her openly, the rumors were spreading quickly. The Earl warned that her composure must be flawless, for one misstep would give her enemies the chance to strike. The warning left Claire shaken. It was not only her own dignity at risk, but also the fragile place she now held beside the prince. Every gesture, every glance, every word might be turned against her. She felt the walls of her chamber close in around her as she paced, her gown trailing over the floor. What had begun as private dread had become a battle fought beneath the eyes of an entire court. When night fell, she returned once more to the window, her hands resting on the sill as she looked out at the city, spread beneath the dark sky. The lights of London flickered like restless stars, each one a reminder of the countless voices that now carried her name. Somewhere among them, she knew, enemies waited, watching, ready to use her against the very man she had been promised to. And though she longed for solitude, she could not escape the truth that her every step was now a step into deeper danger. The days that followed the warning seemed to move with an unbearable weight. Claire carried herself through them with quiet composure, yet within her, the unease deepened. Each moment at court felt sharper than the last, every word spoken in her presence carrying a double edge. Servants lowered their eyes when she passed, as though unwilling to meet her gaze. Courtiers paused their conversations as soon as she entered, their whispers dissolving into silence that was no less revealing than speech. She bore it all with stillness, but the solitude of her thoughts pressed against her with increasing force. Philip remained constant in his public demeanor, severe and commanding, his reputation as unyielding as ever. Yet when his gaze fell upon her, it carried something that unsettled her far more than the silence of the court. She saw expectation there, and something deeper, as though he watched her not only with suspicion, but also with a strange, reluctant need. It was in those moments that she felt both prisoner and confidant, bound to him by ties she had not chosen and did not fully understand. The rumors spread with precision, as though guided by hands that sought her downfall. She heard them whispered in the drawing rooms, caught the half-suppressed smiles of the ladies who feigned politeness, while their eyes betrayed their pleasure at her discomfort. They spoke of her as if she possessed some unnatural power over the prince, some influence that unsettled his judgment. It was not admiration, but suspicion, and it clung to her with each passing day. One evening, as the court gathered once more in the palace for music and games of chance, Claire felt the eyes of the assembly fixed upon her with particular intensity. The prince stood at her side, silent yet resolute, and his very presence kept the whispers hushed, but not extinguished. As the music played, Claire moved with careful grace, her every gesture measured, her every glance observed. It was a test, she realized, one in which a single falter would serve her enemies. When at last the evening drew to a close and the guests began to depart, Philip did not leave her side. Instead, he guided her away from the hall and into the quiet of his private study. The chamber was lit by a single fire, its glow casting shadows across the walls. The silence between them stretched until at last he spoke. His words carried no command, no sharpness, but rather a heaviness that made them more difficult to bear. He confessed what she had sensed, but never expected to hear spoken aloud. He told her that the solitude of his life had grown unbearable, that his authority and severity were but armor against the shadows that haunted him. He admitted that her presence had unsettled him, not as a threat, but as something he could not release. With each word, the mask of the feared prince seemed to fall away, and in its place stood a man stripped of certainty. He told her openly that he could not imagine facing the burden of his life without her. The air in the chamber grew still. Claire felt her breath falter, her heart caught between fear and something more fragile. She had been raised to expect duty, to accept marriage as a contract, but never had she been asked to hold the soul of another in her hands. His declaration was not the command she had dreaded, but neither was it a promise she could easily embrace. It was a plea, spoken by a man whose power seemed to crumble in the very act of confessing. Her silence stretched, heavy as stone. The firelight flickered across the walls, the shadows shifting like restless thoughts. Within her rose a tide of questions she could not answer. Was this vulnerability genuine, or was it another chain to bind her more closely to him? Could she trust a man the world called cruel, even as he laid bare the wound of his heart? Her mind recoiled from the weight of the choice before her, yet she felt it pressing in upon her, relentless and unshakable. The stillness broke only when she inclined her head, acknowledging his words without offering her own. It was not acceptance, nor was it rejection, but it was enough. His gaze did not soften, but the heaviness of it seemed to shift, as though her silence had given him the answer he sought. When she finally withdrew from the chamber, the corridors of the palace stretched before her, silent and dim. Her footsteps echoed softly, carrying her back toward the waiting carriage that would return her home. Each step was a reminder of the weight she now carried, the knowledge that the choice she made would not only shape her own fate, but also determine the course of the man whose declaration still echoed in her ears. As she settled into the carriage, and the horses moved forward through the darkened streets of London, the city lights flickering like distant stars, her thoughts would not rest. She understood now that the moment of decision was near. She would either surrender to the bond he had placed upon her, or she would turn from it and face the consequences of defiance. The path lay before her, unchosen, its shadows stretching long into the night. The morning of the wedding arrived with a silence that felt almost unreal. The city beyond the townhouse stirred with its usual rhythm, carts rolling over the stones, market cries drifting faintly. But within the walls of the Earl of Wexford's residence, the atmosphere was hushed. Servants moved carefully, their voices lowered, their steps softened, as though they too felt the weight of what was to unfold. Claire rose early, her sleep having been shallow, her mind restless. She was dressed in a gown chosen not for grandeur, but for solemnity, its fabric of ivory silk falling with a simple grace. There were no elaborate jewels at her throat, no crown of gems to proclaim wealth. Instead, a ribbon bound her hair, its pale shade lending her an air of dignity rather than ostentation. She looked into the mirror, her reflection calm, her eyes steady. She no longer appeared as the trembling girl of weeks past, but as a woman who had chosen her path, however uncertain it might remain. The carriage ride from the townhouse carried her through quieter streets, far from the great avenues where processions of royalty usually moved. This was no parade, no spectacle for the public gaze. Her parents accompanied her, their pride evident, though tempered by the unusual simplicity of the occasion. The Countess adjusted the folds of her daughter's gown with care, while the Earl spoke sparingly, his tone carrying both gravity and satisfaction. Claire listened in silence, her gaze fixed upon the blurred outlines of London as they passed beyond the windows. The chapel chosen for the ceremony stood apart from the palace, its stone walls weathered, its windows narrow and filled with colored glass. It was a place of quiet devotion, untouched by the grandeur of court life. Within, the air was cool and still, carrying the faint scent of incense. A few pews were occupied by family and loyal companions, their faces solemn as they turned toward the altar. There was no sea of nobles, no endless ranks of courtiers, only those whose presence was necessary and whose loyalty could be trusted. At the altar, Philip stood waiting. His figure was rigid, his attire marked by formality, yet his expression carried a weight unfamiliar to those who knew him only as severe. His eyes fixed upon Claire as she entered, following her steps as though they alone anchored him. He did not speak, yet the stillness of his gaze told her more than any words could. Claire walked the length of the aisle with measured steps, her gown whispering against the stone floor. Each footfall echoed, a quiet testament to the choice she had made. When she reached the altar, she lifted her face, meeting the prince's eyes without faltering. The vows were spoken, solemn and deliberate, each phrase binding them not only in duty, but in something deeper that words could not fully capture. The exchange was simple. No choirs filled the air, no trumpets announced the union. Only the priest's voice carried through the chapel, steady and clear, as he joined their hands and declared them bound. When at last the vows were complete, and the silence of the chapel held them both, Claire felt the finality settle within her. She had chosen not to turn away, but to walk forward into the life that now opened before her. The ceremony concluded without spectacle, and those in attendance offered their quiet blessings. Claire and Philip departed together, stepping out into the muted daylight. A carriage awaited, ready to carry them away from the murmurs of London and the poisoned whispers of the court. For the first time, the air seemed less heavy, the future less suffocating. As the carriage moved, Claire sat beside Philip, her hands resting lightly upon her lap. The silence between them was not the silence of command, nor the silence of fear. It was the quiet of two souls standing at the threshold of something untried. He did not speak, yet his presence beside her felt altered, softened, as though her choice had given him a new form of strength. The journey carried them beyond the city, the streets giving way to quieter lanes bordered by fields. The air grew fresher, the sounds of London fading behind them. Claire looked out through the window, watching the land unfold, each mile carrying them further from the shadows of the palace. She felt a measure of freedom she had not thought possible, though it came not from escape but from the strange peace that followed her decision. When at last they arrived at their destination, it was not a palace but a residence of modest size, far removed from the constant gaze of the court. Its gardens were simple, its walls unadorned with gold, yet its quiet dignity spoke more to Claire than the grandeur of marble halls. Here, away from the endless scrutiny, she and Philip stepped into the beginnings of their new life. The days that followed were marked not by spectacle, but by calm. Claire walked the gardens in the morning, the air scented with roses, the silence broken only by the rustle of leaves. Philip accompanied her at times, his manner still reserved, yet there was a steadiness in him that had not been there before. He seemed less burdened, as though the weight of solitude had eased. For Claire, each moment carried with it a quiet realization. She had not been broken by humiliation, nor consumed by despair. She had endured the downfall, she had found her resolve, and she had chosen her path with clarity. Now, in this quiet retreat, she felt the first stirrings of peace. She did not know what the future would demand of her, but she had stepped into it with courage, and in that courage she found a form of liberation she had once thought impossible. The summer light fell gently across the garden, the warmth of the sun softened by a faint breeze that stirred the branches of the roses. Claire moved slowly along the gravel path, her gown brushing lightly over the ground, her fingers trailing across the blossoms that leaned toward her. The air was fragrant with their perfume, sweet and full, and for the first time in many months, she felt the world around her was not pressing in with judgment, but opening before her with quiet welcome. Philip walked a few steps behind her, his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes fixed not upon the flowers but upon her. His presence was different here, away from the glare of the court and the sharpness of whispers. His figure still carried the gravity of command, but there was no mask of cruelty, no edge of authority in his voice when he finally spoke her name. It was softer, spoken as though he feared the sound itself might disturb the fragile calm they now shared. Claire paused, turning to face him. The sunlight touched her hair, making it gleam like pale gold, and her eyes carried a steadiness that had been hard-won. She had not forgotten the humiliation of the past, nor the fear that had once consumed her, but neither did she let those shadows hold her. She stood before him not as a prisoner of duty, but as a woman who had endured, chosen, and now waited to hear the truth in his words. Philip drew nearer, his expression stripped of the severity he once showed the world. He stopped before her, his voice measured yet filled with a weight of feeling he no longer attempted to conceal. He told her that the life he had lived before their union had been one of power without solace, authority without warmth. He admitted that he had believed himself unworthy of gentleness, and so had driven it from him whenever it appeared. Yet in her presence, he said, the solitude that had long haunted him began to ease. She had tempered his anger, not with fear, but with quiet strength, and in her eyes he had found something he had never known, compassion without judgment. Claire listened in silence, her breath caught between hesitation and hope. The words he spoke were not the commands of a prince, nor the duties of a husband. They were confessions, laid bare without defense, and they reached her in a way that no promise of wealth or title could. She felt the tremor of her own heart, the stirring of a tenderness she had tried to resist, now rising with a force she could not deny. Philip took her hand, his touch uncertain at first, as though he feared she might withdraw. But Claire did not retreat. Her fingers rested within his, warm and steady. His voice grew lower, unsteady for the first time she had ever known it, as he told her that he loved her. The words hung in the air, simple yet profound, carrying with them a truth that broke through the shadows of his past. Claire's eyes filled, not with sorrow, but with a release of all she had carried in silence. She had longed for tenderness, had thought it forever beyond her reach, and now it was given to her not as duty, but as choice. She answered him not with hesitation, but with the clarity of her heart. She told him that she, too, had come to love him, not the cruel prince the world believed him to be, but the man who had revealed to her his wounded soul, who had found in her presence the strength to change. The garden around them seemed to fall into stillness, as though the air itself had paused to hold the moment. Philip drew her closer, his hand lifting to her face, his touch reverent, as though she were both his refuge and his salvation. Claire closed her eyes as he bent to her, and when their lips met, it was with a passion that was not fierce but profound. The culmination of despair turned to hope, of fear transformed into love. They stood together in the quiet of the garden, the roses swaying gently, the sunlight falling like a benediction upon them. The world beyond, the court, the whispers, the burdens of expectation, seemed distant, powerless against the truth they had now embraced. They were no longer bound by chains of duty alone, but by a bond chosen freely, born of trust, and of the courage to see one another as they truly were. As the afternoon waned, they remained side by side, their hands entwined, their silence filled not with absence, but with the presence of understanding. Claire felt a peace settle within her, deeper than she had ever known, and she knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, she would not face them alone. For she had found in Philip not a tyrant to fear, but a companion to love. When the sun dipped lower, casting the garden in golden light, Philip turned to her once more, his eyes clear, his voice steady. He told her that from this day forward, he would walk not as the prince the world had shaped, but as the man she had helped him to become. And Claire, her heart steady and full, answered with the promise that she would walk beside him, not as a pawn of duty, but as his equal, his partner, and his chosen salvation. Their story, born of humiliation and fear, had unfolded into redemption. What had begun as despair had been remade into love, and in that love they found freedom. The path before them was not without shadow, but it was theirs, and in it lay the courage to face whatever might come. And to those who hear their story, let it serve as a reminder. The heart has the power to transform what the world calls cruel into something tender, to uncover light where only darkness was believed to dwell. True courage is not in fleeing from what we fear, but in seeing beyond appearances, in choosing to trust, in daring to love. For it is in the quiet strength of such choices that salvation is found, and in the embrace of love that life is made whole. Thank you so much for listening to this story all the way to the end. We hope it moved you as much as it moved us while telling it. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave us a comment telling us where you're listening from and what you liked the most. Rate this story from 0 to 10. What score would you give it? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like as a show of support. That really motivates us to keep creating and sharing more stories full of emotion and life lessons. And before we go, we want to remind you that an exciting and heartwarming story recommendation will appear on the final screen. If you'd like to enjoy it, just click on the video. Thank you once again for being here, and we'll see you in the next story.